March 1944, Eastern Slovakia. The Carpathian Mountains stood like a frozen wall between German-occupied Europe and the advancing Soviet lines. In the valleys below, American bombers were falling from the sky. Lieutenant Colonel James Harmon sat in a cramped briefing room at 15th Air Force Headquarters in Bari, Italy. The air smelled of diesel and exhausted men. Outside, the runways were lined with B-24 Liberators, their aluminum fuselages scarred from flak and fire. Harmon's hands rested on a map, stained with coffee rings and pencil marks. The marks showed something impossible. 600 miles behind enemy lines, nearly 200 American airmen were trapped. They had been shot down over Romania, Hungary, and Slovakia during raids on German oil refineries. Most had bailed out over hostile territory. Some had been captured. Others had hidden in forests, farmhouses, and caves. A few had made contact with partisan groups. But none of them could get out. The Wehrmacht controlled every road. The Luftwaffe patrolled every corridor. And winter had turned the Carpathians into a frozen fortress. Harmon looked at the map and saw the problem clearly. The men were too far for ground rescue, too dispersed for a single extraction, and too valuable to abandon. These were trained bomber crews, navigators, bombardiers, pilots who understood the newest tactics. Every day they remained behind enemy lines was another day the Germans could interrogate them, execute them, or march them west into camps. But there was no precedent for what Harmon was considering. He wanted to land transport planes in enemy territory, load the men aboard, and fly them out. Not from a secured airfield, not under cover of darkness in friendly territory, from a makeshift strip carved into the snow, defended by partisans, surrounded by German patrols, and located 600 miles from the nearest Allied base. The room was silent when he said it aloud. Captain Michael Novak, an intelligence officer, leaned forward. He was 32, stocky, and spoke with the deliberate tone of a man who had been wrong before and knew the cost. "Sir, we don't have confirmed coordinates. We don't have air superiority. We don't know if the strip can handle a C-47, and if the Germans realize what we're doing, they'll be there waiting." Harmon nodded. He did not argue. He knew the risks. He also knew the men. 3 weeks earlier, the OSS had made contact with a Slovak resistance cell operating near the town of Poprad. The cell was small, 30 men, farmers and miners. They had one radio, one transmitter, and one man who spoke enough English to coordinate. His name was Anton Lukács. He was a schoolteacher before the war. Now he was a partisan commander. Lukács had sent a message through the mountains. It was short, it was clear, and it changed everything. "We have your men. We can protect them, but not for long." Harmon had read the message 3 times. He knew what it meant. The partisans were risking their lives every day those airmen stayed hidden. The Germans were conducting sweeps, burning villages, executing civilians suspected of aiding the Allies. If the Americans did not act soon, the men would be lost, not to the enemy, to time. Harmon looked at Novak. "How long to prepare a C-47 for a high-altitude landing?" Novak hesitated. 48 hours, maybe less. "But, sir, the weather is what it is." Harmon's voice was calm, final. "Get me a volunteer crew, get me a route, and get me Lukács on the radio." The operation had a name now. Operation Windmill. It would become the boldest airlift in American history, and it would begin with a single question. Could a transport plane land in a frozen valley surrounded by German divisions, load nearly 200 men, and take off before the enemy arrived? No one knew the answer, but Harmon was going to find out. Anton Lukács stood at the edge of a snow-covered field near the village of Triduby. The field was 1,200 feet long, narrow, uneven. It sloped slightly downward toward a tree line. On a summer day, it would have been a pasture. Now, in late March, it was a frozen strip of ice and compacted snow. It was the only place for miles flat enough to land a plane. Lukács was 41, thin. His hands were cracked from cold and manual labor. He wore a wool coat that had belonged to a German officer before the officer stopped needing it. Around him, 30 partisans worked in silence. They carried shovels, axes, and farming tools. They were clearing stones, smoothing ruts, marking the edges of the field with branches so the pilot would see the boundaries from the air. None of them had ever built an airstrip before. Lukács had received the message from Barry 2 days earlier. The Americans were coming. They would send one plane first, a test. If it landed safely, more would follow. If it crashed, the operation would end. The responsibility fell to Lukács and his men. They had to make the field ready. They had to keep the Germans away, and they had to do it without drawing attention. The nearest German garrison was 8 miles south, a mechanized unit, 40 soldiers, 3 armored cars. They patrolled the roads every morning. If they saw activity near Tri-Duby, they would investigate. If they found the Americans, they would kill everyone involved. Lukács did not tell his men that. They already knew. He walked the length of the field twice. He measured the distance with paces. He studied the tree line. He memorized the position of the hills. If the pilot came in from the west, he would have a clear approach, but he would also be flying low over German-controlled territory. If he came in from the east, he would have to navigate a narrow pass between 2 ridges. One mistake, and the plane would clip a tree or stall in the turbulence. Lukács stopped at the northern end of the field. He looked toward the forest. Somewhere in those trees, hidden in caves and root cellars, were 47 American airmen. They had arrived in groups over the past 6 weeks. Some had walked for days. Others had been carried by farmers. A few had frostbite. One had a broken leg. All of them were exhausted, starving, and afraid. Lukács had promised them they would go home. He did not know if he could keep that promise. That night, Lukács sat in a stone farmhouse with his radio operator, a young man named Peter who had once worked in a post office. The radio was a British SOE set, heavy, unreliable. It took Peter 20 minutes to establish contact with Barry. When the connection finally came through, the voice on the other end was calm and American. "Windmill ground, this is windmill air. Do you copy?" Peter handed the microphone to Lukács. Lukács spoke slowly, carefully, in broken English. "We copy. Field is ready. Weather is clear. Germans are close." There was a pause. Static crackled through the speaker. Then the voice returned. "Understood. We're coming in tomorrow. Dawn. 1 plane. Be ready." Lukács set the microphone down. He looked at Peter. The boy's face was pale. "What if they don't make it?" Peter asked. Lukács did not answer. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the snow was falling again, soft, silent. It covered the field in white. It covered the paths. It covered the tracks. By morning, the valley would look like it had never been touched. That was good. The Germans would see nothing. But it also meant the Americans would have to trust what they could not see. They would have to trust Lukács. They would have to trust the wind. And they would have to trust that a field of ice could hold the weight of a plane carrying the hopes of 200 men. Lukács closed his eyes. He thought of his wife, his daughter. They had been taken to a camp in Poland 6 months earlier. He did not know if they were alive. He did not know if he would ever see them again. But he knew one thing. If the Americans were willing to risk their lives to save their men, then he would risk his life to help them, because some things were worth dying for. March 29th, 1944, Aero 5:30 hours. Bari, Italy. The C-47 Skytrain sat on the tarmac with its engines idling. The plane was stripped of unnecessary weight, no armor, no extra fuel tanks, just enough to reach Slovakia and return. The pilot was Captain Richard Lebo, 34. Quiet. He had flown supply drops over Yugoslavia and Albania. He had never landed behind enemy lines. His co-pilot was Lieutenant Frank Egan, 26. Nervous hands. He kept checking the instruments even though they had been checked 3 times already. In the cargo bay, 6 OSS officers sat on metal benches. They carried medical supplies, maps, and coded instructions for the partisans. One of them, Major William Dawson, held a folded photograph of his wife. He did not look at it. He just held it. Lebo walked around the plane one last time. He touched the tail, the wing, the landing gear. It was a ritual, something he did before every mission. When he climbed into the cockpit, Egan was already running through the checklist. Fuel, full, radio, clear, route. Egan hesitated. He looked at the map taped to the console. The route was marked in red. It would take them north over the Adriatic, then east over Hungary, then into the Carpathians. They would fly at low altitude to avoid radar. They would navigate by landmarks. And they would land in a valley they had never seen. Route is set, Egan said. Lebo nodded. He pulled on his headset and keyed the microphone. Tower, this is Windmill 1, ready for departure. Windmill 1, you are cleared. Godspeed. The engines roared. The plane shook, and then they were moving. The flight took 4 hours. For the first 2, the sky was clear. Lebo kept the plane low, hugging the coastline, then cutting inland over the plains of Hungary. The land below was flat, empty. Snow-covered fields stretched to the horizon. No movement, no signs of life. At 09:30, they crossed into Slovak airspace. The mountains rose ahead like teeth. The plane bucked in the turbulence. Egan gripped the controls. Lebo adjusted altitude, climbing to clear the ridges, then dropping again to stay below the cloud cover. The radio crackled, static. Then a voice. Windmill 1, this is Windmill ground. Do you copy? Lebo keyed the mic. We copy. Give us your position. 2 kilometers north of Tridubi. Field is marked with branches. Wind is west at 10 knots. Germans are 8 kilometers south. You have 15 minutes. Lebo looked at Egan. Egan's face was white. 15 minutes, Lebo repeated. He pushed the throttle forward. The plane dropped into the valley. The mountains closed in on both sides. Trees blurred past the windows. Lebo scanned the ground. Snow, rocks, forest. Then he saw it. A narrow strip, branches at the edges, figures standing at the northern end. There, Lebo said. He pulled back on the throttle. The plane slowed. The landing gear dropped. Egan called out altitude. 200 feet, 150, 100. The plane shook. The wings dipped. Lebo corrected. The ground rushed up. The wheels touched. The impact was hard. The plane bounced, slid. The tail swung left. Lebo fought the rudder. The brakes screamed. Snow sprayed across the windshield. And then, slowly, the plane stopped. They were down. Lebo sat for a moment. His hands were shaking. Egan was breathing hard. Behind them, one of the OSS officers laughed. A short, sharp sound. We made it. Outside, the partisans were running toward the plane. The cargo door opened. Cold air flooded the cabin. Major Dawson stepped out first. His boots sank into the snow. Around him, partisans stood with rifles slung over their shoulders. Their faces were hard, tired. One of them stepped forward. Anton Lukács. Welcome to Slovakia, Lukács said. Dawson shook his hand. How many men do you have? 47 here. More coming from the east. Maybe 60 total by tomorrow. Dawson looked at the field, at the trees, at the sky. How long until the Germans arrive? They patrol at noon. If they see the plane, they will come. You have 1 hour, maybe less. Dawson turned to Lebo. Can you take 40 men? Lebo calculated weight, fuel, distance. 30, no more. Then we make 2 trips. Lukács led them into the forest. The American airmen were hidden in a series of shallow caves dug into the hillside. They were thin, pale. Some had beards. Others had frostbite on their hands and feet. When they saw Dawson, they stood, slowly, painfully. One of them, a bombardier named Lieutenant Carl Foster, stepped forward. His voice was hoarse. "Are we really getting out?" Dawson nodded. 30 of you, right now. The rest tomorrow." Foster closed his eyes. He did not speak. He just nodded. The men moved quickly. They gathered their few belongings, jackets, boots, letters from home. Some of them thanked the partisans. Others said nothing. They were too tired, too overwhelmed. At 10:45, the first group boarded the plane, 30 men. They packed into the cargo bay, sitting, kneeling, pressed together. Lebo started the engines. The plane turned. The tails swung toward the trees, and then they heard it. The sound of engines, distant, growing louder. Lukács ran to the tree line. He looked south. Through the snow, he saw movement. Vehicles, 3, maybe 4. German armored cars. "They're coming!" he shouted. Lebo did not wait. He pushed the throttle to full. The plane lurched forward. Snow sprayed from the wheels. The Germans were half a mile away, closing fast. The plane picked up speed, 50 knots, 60. The trees loomed ahead. Lebo pulled back on the stick. The plane lifted. The wheels cleared the snow by inches. The wings dipped, steadied, and then they were climbing. Below, the German vehicles stopped at the edge of the field. Soldiers jumped out. They raised their weapons. But the plane was already gone. Lukács watched it disappear into the clouds. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He just turned to his men and said one word. Again. Over the next 6 days, 13 C-47s landed in that frozen valley. They came at dawn, at dusk, sometimes in pairs. The partisans defended the field with rifles, homemade explosives, and desperation. The Germans never reached it in time. 173 American airmen were evacuated. Not one was left behind. When the last plane took off on April 4th, Anton Lukács stood alone in the field. The snow was trampled, scarred. The branches had been scattered by propeller wash, but the valley was silent again. Lukács never saw his wife or daughter again. He was killed 2 months later during a German reprisal. His name does not appear in most histories of the war, but in a small museum in Slovakia there is a photograph. It shows a snow-covered field, a line of men in American flight jackets, and one man in a wool coat standing at the edge of the frame. Operation Windmill was declassified in 1967. It remains the largest airborne rescue operation conducted behind enemy lines during World War II. The official report, filed by Lieutenant Colonel James Harmon, ends with a single line: success achieved through coordination between Allied forces and Slovak resistance. Casualties, 0. Losses, none. Recommendation, commendation for all involved. The men who were saved went on to fly again. Some returned to combat. Others trained new crews. A few became instructors. They rarely spoke of Slovakia, but every one of them remembered the sound of engines in the dark, the weight of snow under their boots, and the face of a school teacher who risked everything so they could go home. History forgets most acts of courage, but some are too bold to disappear. Some are written in snow, in silence, in the frozen valleys where ordinary men did the impossible and succeeded. September 1968. 24 years after the last C-47 lifted off from Tridubi. The Cold War had divided Europe into concrete and wire. Slovakia was behind the Iron Curtain now. The village had changed. New roads, new buildings. But the field remained. Lieutenant Carl Foster stood at the edge of that field. He was 52 now. Grey hair, reading glasses. A scar on his left hand from frostbite that never fully healed. He had not been back since 1944. He had tried twice. Both times, the Czech government denied his visa. The war was over. The borders were closed, and the men who had saved him were ghosts. But in the summer of 1968, something shifted. The Prague spring brought a brief thaw. Borders loosened. Travel permits were issued. Foster applied immediately. He told no one, not his wife, not his children. He simply bought a ticket, packed a small bag, and flew to Prague. From there, he took a train east, through the countryside, past towns he did not recognize and rivers he remembered. When he reached Poprad, he hired a car. The driver was young. He did not ask questions. Foster gave him directions in broken Slovak learned from a phrase book. Tridubi, Foster said. The driver nodded. They drove for an hour. The roads were narrow, paved now. But the mountains had not changed. The Carpathians still rose like frozen waves against the sky. When they reached the village, Foster asked the driver to stop. He paid him, told him to wait, and then he walked. The field was smaller than he remembered. Or perhaps he had grown. The trees were taller. The ground was overgrown with grass and wildflowers. But the shape was the same. The slope, the tree line, the distant hills. Foster walked to the center of the field. He knelt. He pressed his hand into the earth. It was warm, soft, nothing like the ice and snow he remembered, but beneath the surface he could still feel it, the weight of history, the echo of engines, the voices of men who had stood here and waited for a miracle. He heard footsteps behind him. An old woman approached. She wore a black dress and a wool shawl. Her face was lined. Her hands were gnarled. She stopped a few feet away and spoke in Slovak. Foster did not understand. He shook his head. "I'm sorry. I don't speak—" "You are American," she said. Her English was slow, accented, but clear. Foster nodded. "Yes." She studied him for a long moment. Then she pointed to the field. "You were here, in the war." It was not a question. "Yes," Foster said. "I was here." The woman's expression did not change. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She handed it to Foster. He unfolded it carefully. The paper was brittle, yellow with age. It was a photograph, black and white. It showed a group of men standing near the tree line, Americans in flight jackets, partisans in wool coats, and in the center, one man, thin, solemn, Anton Lukács. Foster's throat tightened. He looked at the woman. "Where did you get this?" "My father," she said. "He was partisan. He died, long time ago." "What was his name?" "Peter." Foster remembered. The radio operator, the boy who had helped coordinate the landings. Foster had seen him only once, a thin young man with scared eyes and steady hands. "He was brave," Foster said. The woman nodded. She pointed to the photograph, to Lukács. "This man, he saved you." "Yes." "The Germans killed him. June 1944. They burned his house, took his family." Foster already knew this. He had read the reports, the OSS files, the declassified documents. But hearing it spoken aloud, here, in this place, made it real in a way the files never had. "I'm sorry," Foster said. The woman shook her head. "Do not be sorry. He chose. He knew." She turned and pointed to the northern edge of the field. There, they buried him. No stone, no name. The communists did not allow it. Foster stood. He walked to the spot she had indicated. There was nothing there, just grass, flowers, earth. But he knelt anyway. He placed his hand on the ground, and he spoke. "Thank you." The words felt inadequate, hollow, but they were all he had. Behind him, the woman spoke again. "He is not forgotten. Not here. The old ones remember. We tell the children. We tell them what he did." Foster nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. The woman handed him the photograph. "Keep it. You were there. You should have it." Foster tried to refuse, but she pressed it into his hand. Then she turned and walked back toward the village. Foster stood alone in the field. He looked at the photograph, at the faces. Some he recognized, others he did not. But every one of them had been part of something impossible, something that should not have worked, but did. He folded the photograph carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. Then he walked back to the car. 3 days later, Foster returned to the United States. He did not speak about his trip, not to reporters, not to historians, but he wrote a letter, a long letter. He addressed it to the Department of Defense, to the Air Force Historical Research Agency, to anyone who would listen. In the letter, he described what he had seen: the field, the woman, the unmarked grave. He requested that Anton Lukács be formally recognized for his role in Operation Windmill. He requested that the other partisans be acknowledged. He requested that their sacrifice not be erased by politics or time. The letter was filed, catalogued, stored in an archive in Alabama. Nothing happened, but Foster did not stop. He contacted other survivors of Operation Windmill, men he had not spoken to in years, pilots, navigators, bombardiers. He told them what he had found. He shared the photograph, and slowly, quietly, they began to organize. In 1972, a memorial was proposed, a plaque to be placed in Triduby. The Czech government refused. In 1985, the proposal was resubmitted, refused again. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Borders opened. Governments changed. In 1994, 50 years after the last C-47 left that frozen field, a memorial was finally erected. It stands at the northern edge of the field, a simple stone marker. On it, 3 names are engraved: Anton Lukács, Peter Novotny, and 30 others who fought and died defending the valley. Beneath the names, a single line in English and Slovak: "They made the impossible real." Carl Foster attended the dedication ceremony. He was 78. He walked with a cane, but he stood straight when they unveiled the stone. And when the speeches were finished, he placed his hand on the marker, he closed his eyes, and he whispered the words he had been carrying for 50 years. "We didn't forget you. The field is still there, overgrown, quiet. But if you stand in the center and listen, you can almost hear it. The sound of engines, the voices of men, the weight of courage too bold to be forgotten. Some stories are written in fire and steel, others are written in snow and silence. But all of them are written by the same hand, the hand of those who refused to leave anyone behind,